You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Robots as battlefield companions, partners not in crime, but in criminology. How do robots fit into the overarching national security layer? And when we talk about robots, what do we mean? Do we mean the Arduino project I had over the Christmas break? Or do we mean machine learning on my laptop? Do we mean AI assisting me getting through life? Or do we mean Siri, who doesn't know how to shut up at the most inconvenient time? G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, Mick, the humblest host out there of a show named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. I don't think there were 19 Prussian military thinkers. Now, thank you very much for all your support on iTunes, support on Spotify. It's been great. Excellent to see the Spotify network grow. It took us a while to get on there, but now that I'm sure I'm not going to be sued for by anyone for copyright breaches, I'm pretty confident our Spotify list will grow. And if you are looking for copyright breaches, just have a look at War for Idiots on YouTube. There's a few videos missing for obvious reasons. Thanks. Now, also, those members of the TDP community, I want to thank you for your support and your engagement on our own little private social media network there. It's been great to see you engaging and putting forward your thoughts. And as a result of that, we'll have a question from a listener from our subscribers today. Now, I talked about machine learning, AI, and robotics just in the intro, but to be honest, I don't really know much about it. For those listeners that have heard me talk about it before, you can see that I lean pretty heavily on my guests, which is lucky because the guests I got today know a bit more about it than I do. In fact, they've used a creative method of exploring the concepts. Now, listeners of the show know that I'm a big fan of what is known as FIC-int, or fiction intelligence. That's right, I didn't swear there, FIC-int. And it is a way of exploring key national security issues using creative writing or any other creative process, I suppose. So listeners know that personally I'm a big fan of creative practice in professional development, and I think this is a growing area. We've just seen a heap of science fiction works being done on the Australian military's education site, The Forge. In fact, we might have a few authors that might knock these two next guests off their perch pretty soon. So it's great to see the work being done there. So creative practice is quite popular these days in the online professional military education space. But maybe we get the experts to tell us how that can help us explore the intersection of technology and the future of national security. So my guests today are, first one, no surprise and a big friend of the show, been on here before, is August Cole. Now, August is an author exploring the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of FIC-int storytelling. His talks, short stories and workshops have taken him from speaking at the Nobel Institute in Oslo to presenting at SXSW Interactive to tackling the dirty name obstacle at Fort Benning. With Peter W. Singer, no spoilers for who the next guest is, he is the co-author of the bestseller Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War in 2015. And as you remember, listeners, he came on the show pretty early on in the Dead Prussian's life to talk about Ghost Fleet. It's quite an excellent book, and I know some of our listeners have just finished it literally overnight. And their next book, Burn In, a novel of the real robot revolution, 2020, and that's what we're here to talk about today. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Centre on Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He directed the Council's Art of the Future project, which explores creative and narrative works for insight into the future of conflict, from its inception in 2014 through to 2017. He works on creative futures at Spark Cognition, an artificial intelligence company, so he might be responsible for the robot revolution. And Ghost Fleet was a bestseller and features on professional military lists around the world. In fact, I don't know too many lists that it's not on since it came out. It was quite a buzz. So I'm sure most of my listeners have either read it. If not, you've got links in the show notes. Go buy it. This near future thriller about the next World War was published in 2015 by Eamon Dolan Books, a Houghton Mifflin imprint. That's news. I just assumed it was Houghton Mifflin, but Eamon Dolan Books is a great little name too. Almost sounds like an indie publisher, but they're not. because they wouldn't have the worldwide distribution that Houghton Mifflin has, because I bought Ghost Fleet local in a very obscure place in Australia. He also edited the Atlantic Council science fiction collection, War Stories from the Future, published in November 2015. The anthology featured his short story, Ant Farm, about the intersection of swarm warfare, additive manufacturing, and crowdsourced intelligence, which is probably no longer sci-fi anymore. I think we're probably almost at that stage. He's the author of numerous other short stories about the future of conflict, and he's appeared on the show twice before, ladies and gents. So make sure you check them out. You'll see that August is much better at answering questions than I am at asking them. And from 2007 to 2010, August reported on the defense industry for Wall Street Journal. So he's got a background as a defense journalist. He's from Washington. He covered companies from Boeing to Blackwater. So the good, the bad, and the ugly, really. And as a broad defense policy and political matters. From 1998 to 2006, he worked as an editor and reporter for MarketWatch.com, which is a financial news website where he began covering defense issues, including private military contractors. He received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Pennsylvania and a Master in Public Administration from John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is also a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Royal United Services Institute, great friends of the show, and the AI Initiative of the Future Society at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he's a former non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point, and all non-resident fellows at the Modern War Institute at West Point are good-looking fellas. Now, my next guest is Peter Warren Singer. He's a strategist at New America. He has been named the Smithsonian as one of the nation's 100 leading innovators by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, by Foreign Policy to their top 100 global thinkers list, and as an official mad scientist for the US Army's Training and Doctrine Command. That's a brilliant title to receive. Peter is the author of multiple best-selling award-winning books. No author, living or dead, has more books on the professional military reading lists. That's a great claim. And we know Big Carl only wrote one, really. His wife wrote it. His non-fiction books include Corporate Warriors, Rise of the Privatized Military Industry, Children at War, Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution, and Conflict in the 21st Century, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, what everyone needs to know. And I can personally recommend that book. I absolutely love that book, and I was someone who didn't know much about it at the time. And most recently, Like War, which explores how social media has changed war and politics, and that is a cracking read, ladies and gents. And I love the bits about Taylor Swift and the way that she uses influence operations essentially for her marketing. It was named on Amazon and Foreign Affairs Book of the Year and reviewed by Booklist as Like War should be reading for everyone living in a democracy and all who aspire to. My students at University of Canberra know a fair bit about that book because I happened to read it whilst I was teaching the credible communication course there, and some of them have now gone on to work in the fields described in there, all the fields that should be best prepared for that. He is also the co-author of a new type of novel. That's awesome awesome language there, Mick. He's melding the format of a techno thriller to communicate non-fiction research. His first with August Cole, Ghost Fleet, a novel of the Next World War, which was both a top summer read and joined the professional military reading list of every branch in the US military. And I think it's probably every branch or service here in Australia as well. It's leading to briefings everywhere from the White House to the Pentagon. His latest, again with August, is Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution. And if you haven't got a hint, listeners, that's what we're discussing today. And that's out on the 26th of May, both in the US and Australia, and most likely in the UK as well. If not, jump on and check the show notes, listeners. I'll make sure you know whether it is coming out at that time in the UK. New Zealand, no one really knows or cares. It has been described by the creator of Lost and Watchmen as a visionary new form of storytelling, rollercoaster ride of science fiction blended with science fact. And by the head of Army Cyber Command as, I loved Burn In so much that I've already read it twice. And listeners, I am about 35% of the way through Burn In, and I tell you what, you're going to love it. His past work included serving at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Harvard University, an editor of Popular Science magazine, and as the founding director of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings. where he was the youngest person named senior fellow in its 100-year history. So, ladies and gents, obviously I've got some underachievers on the show. August and Peter, how are you? Welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us,
Mick. It's good to be on. I think this is the biannual appearance on the Dead Prussian for me. Right, every 2 years, I sold my soul in 2017 when I went down, or 16 when I went down to Australia, and I have to reappear and connect with you again. So it's good to be here.
That's yeah, I think it is biannual, and for those listeners that have heard August before, you can't see his hair, but I think we're having a competition for who is the scruffiest, except for Peter, who looks immaculate. So at least someone on the shows are reasonably professional about doing it. But I've got the excuse that it's 5 a.m. here in Australia. I'm not sure what August is. Although I know surfing is an interest of yours, and you definitely look like you're about to head to the beach.
We're all sporting the different ways of dealing with coronavirus haircuts. August took the I'm not going to cut it till he gets out of the house mode. And I pulled out some old clippers that I had from graduate school when I used to cut my own hair when I was a poor graduate student, and picked up the skill set back then. And about a week back, I decided it was time to just give myself a haircut. So, yeah.
It's brave. But it actually, you can't tell it's a home haircut, ladies and gents, because there have been some shockers out there. But it's quite good. I think, look, Peter, you seem to be doing all right as a leading thinker and writer. But if not, at least you know you've got a career of as a barber to fall back on.
Yeah, it's always that.
Gents, before we start discussing burn-in, and I'm really keen to discuss burn-in, I actually want to hear about how you became writers of thinking and writers on national security issues, noting that, August, you've had quite a few cracks at this before, and Peter, you haven't. But I'll go to August first, because listeners will want to compare to see if he's changed his story. And remember, if your story's too close to the last time, it means that it's too well rehearsed. So August, I'll go with you first.
You know, I as someone who makes things up for a living, I would hope my story and narrative gets more fantastic with each telling. And it is a journey that I've been on, really. I mean, this is the 10-year mark after which I left journalism behind, when I left the newsroom at the Wall Street Journal to try to figure out how to write more about what was going to happen than what had happened. You know, you'd think that I would have understood that that's what journalism was really focused on, you know, by that point in my career. But you know, when I got to the Journal in DC, it allowed me to do some, I think, really great work, but I just kept wanting to write about things that were down the pike. And that's, of course, not what even a great daily newspaper has in its DNA. So I walked away and I wrote a manuscript that never went anywhere about private military contractors, but it led to Pete and I collaborating after I moved up here to the Boston area. And so since then, really, it's been this very experimental approach, you know, to a mix of think tank work, using fiction, whether it's short stories, whether it is a novel like Ghost Sleep from about 5 years ago, to try to help people avoid strategic surprise. You know, if I have to distill what I'm doing down now to that kind of elevator pitch, it's essentially, you know, using narrative to avoid strategic surprise. And that's where that FICINT framework comes in, you know, where you know, I think you're always trying to figure out shorthand, especially in DC or in the national security realm, where acronyms are king. So having something like that, I think, has been helpful to see it take hold. But of course, it's about much more than, you know, branding. Like, we are at this moment when technology, these larger social and political forces, are so much greater than what conventional analytical or even foresight capabilities can handle. And so we're at this really nice moment to see a fusion of really hard applied problems, just in part through, you know, short stories or graphic novels, both from top down, but also grassroots efforts. So it's a really exciting time to be at this point. And, you know, when I think about the next 10 years, I think it's actually going to become even more impactful in seeing the generation of military members who are working on these techniques now, as they further, you know, roll them out when they get more and more responsibility, have more and more experience.
So for me, I actually talked about the start of this in a nonfiction book I did called Wired for War. And basically, growing up, I was one of those kids that if you handed me a stick within a couple of seconds, it was either going to be a Tommy gun that I was going to defend the neighborhood against attackers, or it was going to be a lightsaber. So it was always this back and forth between those two worlds. And in particular, I grew up reading my grandfather's books in his study. He was a World War II veteran. And so, just grew up with a love of history. And that was sort of the spark for me originally on. And then obviously went on, worked in the space of national security and policy, did a bunch of different books on, all sorts of different topics. I think like August, I was drawn to topics that didn't seem to fit how we understood the world, but there they were. So the first book I did looked at the rise of private military contractors, back when we thought, only governments fought wars. That, as an aside, was actually how August and I first connected. I was a source for August when he was a reporter, in particular during the Abu Ghraib investigation and all the scandals and issues that are revolved around private military contractors in Iraq. August would call me up and he would interview me, and then we would, we got in a kind of good back and forth, and then we kept running into each other separate from that on the subway, where we lived in a similar neighborhood, and that's actually how we first became friends. Originally, him, pulling things out of me to use for his journalistic ways. But I crossed over into the fiction realm, actually coming out of that nonfiction side. I did advisory work for a bunch of different entertainment projects, Hollywood movies, video games like Call of Duty. And originally it was just technical advising, what kind of weapon should be in X, how should this be? But I kept giving them feedback on, what, your character actually should do X, Y, and Z. A better way of looking at the scene would be this. And some of them would say, thank you very much. We don't need that. Other ones, actually a pretty prominent Hollywood writer took me aside and said, look, you can do this. Your stuff is pretty good on the fiction side. You should think about not advising. And it was around that moment that August had taken that jump, and we teamed up on Ghost Fleet. We came up with a story, and leading to the where we are right now. One of the things is, it was originally, we just wanted to tell that story. We wanted to recreate for people the kind of experience that we had growing up, reading the Tom Clancy books and whatnot. We'd both had similar experiences like that as kids, and we enjoyed it. So we wanted to recreate it, but then it ended up having actually, I think, more policy impact than all my other nonfiction books. And that was a surprise. It hasn't obviously knocked me out of doing nonfiction, but there was something there. And that's really what we're after with the Burn-In project, where in this case, it was not just, we had a really, I'm so excited about the story, the real badass character at the middle of it. I think people are going to like to meet her, the bad guy, all that sort of stuff. But also, unlike even in Ghost Fleet, from the very start, the research side, the idea of using it as a way to carry across useful information to people is baked into it. It was baked into the very design. It's baked into every scene. And so it's basically taking this idea of what August calls fiction, sometimes we call it useful fiction, taking it to the next level.
Yeah, and I as someone who works with computer scientists and trying to understand what they're saying to me quite often, I've definitely loved the way that it's presented in a way that I can connect with, which I guess is why Ghost Fleet was such a success. The way it's done, like it's an accessible narrative about the technology and the risks in international security and the future of conflict. So, as I read it when I was in the military, and I have absolutely no surprises that it was as successful as it was. And it's kind of opened up the door. Now now Burn-In is actually what we're here to discuss. Ghost Fleet's old news. Let's talk about Burn-In. we kind of need a bit of an overview of the book for the listeners, but we don't want spoilers because one, you guys need to put food on the table, so we need people to buy it, but also we need them to read it when they buy it, and a lot of people get a bit upset with spoilers. Now we'll reverse the answering order, so maybe we can have an overview from Peter, and then August can give us a little bit on the writing, the writing process, because I'm sure a lot of listeners, once they've heard the overview, are going to be like, well, how do two people get together to write that? So Peter, what's the overview of Burn In?
So Burn In is a new form of book. It's a cross of novel and nonfiction. The idea is that it's a techno thriller. It follows the hunt for a terrorist through the streets of a future Washington, D.C. But baked into the story are over 300 factual explanations and predictions, replete with the nonfiction endnotes to show their source. Yep. So the idea is to both entertain and learn about key new issues that are going to shape all our lives. So you meet as I mentioned, an awesome new kind of hero, in particular for this genre, her new partner, but through their hunt for a new also kind of villain, you learn about everything from how AI works to what will be its impact on politics, security, economy, even family life and toys. And both of us are dads, and we liken it as akin to sneaking veggies into a smoothie, except in this case, it's for people who would normally, avoid an academic white paper. So you can enjoy it if you just want to be entertained, but also you'll walk away from it knowing more about, and it might be big macro trends, or it might be micro details, again, in everything from AI to cybersecurity to future of warfare issues to literally what comes next in toys.
Yeah. And August, how the hell do you write that with a co-writer and sneak the education into the smoothie?
With Ghost Fleet, Pete and I had to answer some really fundamental questions about collaboration. And because everybody, I think, does have their own approaches toward the project, being able to essentially ally around a workflow, in the same way that people who are screenwriters or visual artists might, really lets us be more efficient. And so in our case, when you read the book, you should never be able to tell who wrote what line, who wrote what chapter or what page. And even in my own instance, I had someone say, I love this line the other day. And I was like, I can't even remember who wrote that. And that really is the kind of outcome that is hard to do, especially in fiction, but where voice is so important, especially in a character-driven story like this, where you really need to have a consistent way that you're placing the reader, in the skin of your protagonist, alongside your villain. And we're also, unlike Ghost Fleet with Burn In, we're really taking a singular protagonist and following them on their own arc, rather than hopping around the world, going from space to undersea to, dogfighting. That's not the way this story is told. This is a techno thriller really following a heroine or hero on her journey. And so the ways that we synchronize the storytelling, starts with a really fundamentally good outline, well researched, very clear understanding of where the story is going at which point. Like any good plan, it only lasts as long as, until you put, pen to the paper to butcher the aphorism. This obviously allowed us to kind of deviate when we needed to, but by and large, we kind of know where the story is before we start putting words on paper. Yeah. And I think that's really important because again, we are both, trying to fulfill this mission that we, I think, individually approach our work with. And that requires, doing much more than just writing fiction. So for all the other work that we enjoy doing, we want to be able to make time for that too. And so being efficient on the production side, I think is paramount. And that's, I think, something that people who are writing on the side or squeezing in their fiction in the early morning hours, while they have downtime at work, can also be mindful of. And that the more, clearly you've laid out your recipe, so to speak, when it comes time to cook, like you're ready to go, your ingredients are there. For example, I use the notepad function on my iPhone every day. Ideas, concepts. I'm constantly dumping, Twitter links, PDFs of research reports into that document because it allows me to have a repository that I can dive into. And so that's the kind of like way that we approach research and hoovering up over, a period of, essentially 2 years, the various data points, the facts to make this, world that we envisioned credible, because you're obviously trying to work together to stretch the bounds of imagination and deliver something that feels fresh and new, but at the same time anchoring that story in reality enough that when you do scare the heck out of somebody, you can even have a bigger impact, keep them up later at night because they can go to that footnote and see that thing that scared them is real. And they need to be thinking about what is the potential solution or response to a problem like that, like infrastructure security, think problems in the cyber domain, for example. So that's some of the nuts and bolts of for a story like this. And when you're trying to describe human machine teaming, which is really at the core of this novel, that requires a technological foundation, but also a lot of introspection on the human relationships between ourselves and how we invest ourselves emotionally in inanimate objects and things like that. And so there was a lot of exploration conversation about that, which was different than in I think the depths that we went to on Ghost Fleet.
And that's actually a brilliant segue into my next question. So I'm not sure I'm sure you guys did read the questions, although listeners and former guests will know that I often send the idea of each episode to my guests extremely late. But that's for very good reasons, because I'm very lazy and slow. In this book you talk about, and I'm glad you said that bit about the lines. You're not sure who wrote them, because I had a few lines I highlighted, and I was going to do a competition to see if you guys knew who wrote them, but I'm not going to do that now because you're just going to say, oh, we both did. So I'll focus on the relationships you have with technology and how you explore them. Because this book's not just about people and tech; it's about people and tech and how it affects national security. Much like Ghost Fleet was, and I was having a good conversation about Ghost Fleet, and the idea behind Ghost Fleet is not that you need to revert to old technology out of some sort of stubbornness. It's when you use the new technology for as long as it's useful, and then if then you go back to what military people call reversionary ways if you need to, and it's about having a mixed skill set and understanding of your relationship with technology and how you do your job. And Ghost Fleet was about the fight. What I've found is the relationships you've explored in Burn-In between people and technology is so much more detailed in terms of the interpersonal relationships that people start to develop. So I guess, how do you see these relationships that that people have with technology? And each person, I suppose in the book, each person has a very different relationship with technology. But I'll go to August first, and then Peter. So how do you see these relationships affecting national security?
Our relationships with technology are fundamentally about trust. And we're at this really interesting point in the US, and I think in other Western democracies too, where trust is in short supply when it comes to big institutions. And to have ourselves in a historical moment right now where confidence in everything from the authority of the executive branch to the veracity of our scientific experts when it comes to like the COVID crisis, I think positions us in a really precarious spot for a healthy relationship with technology in the next decade. More so when the forces that are going to be unleashed in the economy, in society, from automation, from machine learning, can have potentially very destructive tendencies. And so from a security perspective, a lot of the debate about killer robots, for example, focuses on the battlefield. But I think there is another societal stability question that is wrapped up, of course, in economics, the social contract, that we really haven't even begun to wrap our heads around in understanding. The resiliency of a Western society is far less than I think we appreciate. And I think if anything, the unfortunate tragedy that we're going through right now with this pandemic is that we've underestimated how badly we can handle situations that I think if we had a truly unified or sense of common cause, we could see our way through much better. And I worry about the systemic problems that are being revealed today as offering a preview of what's ahead and us not doing anything about it. And so if I can hope that the book at least allows people to understand that a line can be drawn between, the worst unemployment in the U.S. since the Great Depression and fundamental questions about the role of work in the American economy and also in American society, because the sorts of extremism, the sorts of rifts that will be opened up and deepened for profit, for exploitation, in this kind of an environment, I think is all too real of a security risk and not one that gets enough credit.
The great thing about going second is that I can sort of jot notes as August is giving a brilliant answer and put it in sort of a framework. And to me, there's three different ways of answering you, three different big issues to put on the table. One is that idea of trust, and trust is a real theme throughout the book, but it plays with how trust has different meanings. There's the way that we often talk about trust. I trust you, I like you. But the engineering idea of trust is just simply, it works as expected. It behaves in a way that is expected. So for example, I can distrust someone because they're a liar, but actually I can, if I'm taking that second definition of just as expected, I can trust that they will always lie, and I can therefore operate well in a world that assuming they're always a liar. And that those two different ideas of trust are what we play in. And then also the flip side, distrust. What does it mean to trust the machines in our world? What does it mean to trust each other? Is it that we, like each other, or is it just things work the way that we planned? And then in turn, if you're a bad guy, if you're going after our world and, insert whether it's a state actor or it's like in the book, a terrorist, you might go after that idea of trust. And again, it might be the systemic way, it might be the way that works as planned. So trust is a big theme, but it really turns on, what do you mean by trust? The second is the idea of human-machine teaming. And that's a fundamental question, obviously for militaries, relevant to, many of the listeners of this podcast. It's at the center of question, for what tactics and doctrine looks like moving forward. But it also really is an issue that hits across society, whether it's at a coffee shop, whether it's in education, that question of how humans and machines come together. Do they work together, or is it that there's a replacement? And there's all sorts of different visions of it that we play out in the book. At one end of the spectrum, you've got remote control. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got swarming, where they're off there doing everything on their own. You also have the idea kind of in the middle, sometimes called the wingman, the robotic wingman concept. And we play with that in the story. And you see how those different ideas play out, those different plans play out in reality. But then, we're trying to make it realistic. We're trying to learn from it. So how does someone attack that? If you're operating in one way, how do they go after that? How do they take advantage of it? And the final idea is, what's the effect of these notions of trust and these kinds of teaming? It can be, there's an effect on the human and the machine going back and forth. They are machines, and yet we can't help ourselves but to endow them with what we think are their emotions, their identities. We already see that with, if you've got a Siri or an Alexa in your house. I'll find myself, I'll get mad when it doesn't give me the answer that I wanted, or when it says that there's going to be bad weather. I get mad at it. I don't get mad at my toaster, but I get mad at my Alexa, right? My kids, speaking of trust, probably trust it more than me. When I say something and they don't believe it, they'll go ask the machine, is that, really, did this team really win the Super Bowl? We don't think Dad is telling the truth. So there's that idea. And that's with something right now that's not all that intelligent. Let's dial it forward 10, 15 years. What is that like? And again, we also saw military versions of that. Back in the day, in Iraq, you had people who would run out under heavy machine gun fire to rescue their UGV, the unmanned ground system that was doing things like bomb detection. they would rescue it. Or in another case in Afghanistan, units would give their blown up bomb bots, they would give them funerals. And it sounded silly, but it was like, no, this thing saved our lives. We got to give it respect. That's already happened. What about moving forward? But you also have this idea of how does it affect not the human machine relationship? How does it affect the different human to human relationships? And it's funny, this is a book that has a lot of super scary stuff play out in it. To me, one of the creepiest moments is actually just when the main character goes into a Starbucks with her daughter, and there's an employee who greets them by name. And then our character has this dialogue in her head of, is it because we've been coming to this Starbucks for years and she knows me and she knows my daughter? Or is it because face recognition technology, it automatically told her who I was?
Yeah.
And that same thing, that's at a Starbucks, but there's obviously the very same thing's going to happen out on patrol, whether you're a police officer or you're in special operations deploying to Afghanistan.
Yeah. It's interesting. I like that you brought up also the bit about, Alexa and Siri, although I dare say my Siri is smarter than I am. Because Siri's done everything from interrupt me during lectures at university through to my children have figured out how to hijack Siri when we're driving in the car to play music. When you've got a 7-year-old who's better at verbal commands of the computer that's part of controlling your car, that's really scary. So I guess the human relationship I've got to work on is with my 7-year-old. So I stop being hijacked. But it's the idea of trust, human machine teaming, and the economic impacts are quite fascinating. And I really enjoy in Burn-In, ladies and gentlemen, that the social implications of job loss are key to it, right? And we know this was a big thing for the 2016 election, and we know it's probably going to be a big thing for you guys for the 2020 election. We're a little bit more insulated here in Australia, but that's because we've shut down a lot of our manufacturing already, and we offshored it. So it's the automated processes of manufacturing aren't affecting us as much because we already were in a bad place in that area. But I guess what hit me with this book was like, man, we got to do something. So I guess the benefit of talking to I'm going to call you guys prognosticators, people who look forward into the future and try and provide us various options of what that future might look like, as opposed to a lot of the staple on the show, which is historians who you can never get to provide an assessment about the future because that's not the historical practice. So at least I can ask, hey, what do I do to you guys? Because this is your bread and butter, looking at the future and then recommending a few paths where a few paths might lead us. So I guess what are some of the critical concepts we need to understand now, most importantly, to avoid not a human revolution? That there's probably going to be a few of those, although there's a few failed ones quite recently this week. To avoid a robot revolution in future. Now I'm going to go to Peter to answer that one first.
So since you set me up that way, I'm actually going to jump back in history. And by that, we actually have a problem in the way we talk about robots, and we're on the 100-year anniversary of it. Exactly 100 years back, the word robot was created actually in science fiction in a play called RUR. And ever since, we've thought about robots as mechanical servants who wise up and then rise up. That's always the narrative, the way we think about robotics, from that first play to Terminator, Matrix, to all the discussion out there today of killer robots. And again, this has hit everything from, not just sci-fi, but real world policy. There's and even the way that, people decide what to research or not. There's a $5 billion US dollar program on the existential threats of robots. And it's all about this idea of a robot revolt. And our contention, and, it comes from the research, is that the issue is not a robot revolt, it's a robotics revolution. It's the idea of a new kind of industrial revolution. And the way to think about that from that is, and there's three implications that come out of it. One is we are entering a phase where AI and automation are essentially rewiring the economy. That means they're also rewiring everything that comes out of that: war, politics, society, you name it. And it cuts across, almost every single profession. There was a study done by Oxford University. You said, oh, we're insulated in Australia. No, there was a study done by Oxford University that looked at 702 different occupational specialties, different professions out there, and essentially found that 45% of them are going to be replaced or displaced over the next 20 years. Now, some people will go, oh, that's too high. There was a different study done by PricewaterhouseCoopers and said, the consulting company, and they looked at it and said, no, not in the 40s. It's only going to be 38%. That's still a significant amount. The lowest, we actually, again, talking about, world building, but also research, we actually built a data set that brought together every single estimate that's ever been done of these. There's 1,300 different reports and studies that have ever been done on it. The lowest that we can find was a OECD one that said, no, it's only 9% of jobs that are going to be automated. That's still a huge amount, right? And so the point out of this is that that's a really big deal. And if you go back in history, the last industrial revolution led to, new winners and losers at the global level, at the national level, at the business level, at the individual level. It led to good things, mass consumer goods. It led to bad things, global climate change. It led to new political movements, new things like workers' rights, women's rights. None of that happens without the Industrial Revolution. Oh, by the way, it also led to communism and fascism that we then spend, a good 100 years working our way through. So that's the first issue. The second issue is anytime you get new technology, you get, new questions of how to use it, and what are the, how best to use it, how you should not use it, what are the legal, moral, ethical issues that come out of that. And that's been the story of everything from, steam engine to submarine, machine gun, cyber weapon, you name it. Same thing here, except this is a different kind of tool. It's a tool that doesn't just shift what's in the hand of the human. It replaces the human in part. It operates in ways that the humans don't understand. That's the very appeal of it. So that means we have these new questions of machine permissibility. What should it be allowed to do or not? And machine accountability. Okay, who controls it? And if things go wrong, who do we hold responsible? And, we play with that in the book at everything from, what is it? What do those questions look like for a police officer? What do they look like in the middle of a firefight that's a, special ops style event? What does it look like for a coffee shop? And then the final thing is you get new security questions, and you get new security questions in terms of how cyber threats are going to change. You won't just see stealing of information, not to plot spoil, but you'll see new kinds of crimes, a murder conducted through cyber means to burn someone's smart home down, or it might be something larger, holding an entire city hostage by going after critical infrastructure. And here again, it's not just us dreaming it up. We did interviews, for example, with someone who works on the water systems of Washington, D.C. And he basically sort of talked us through how you could recreate certain things for people. We'll make them work a little. Google 1936 Washington, D.C. flood, and you'll see what happens in a major city. Similar things could be done like in a Canberra and a Sydney.
Yeah. And
sorry, I should add one last thing on that. It also go back to the new ideologies also means you get new violent ideologies. Yeah. And the last industrial revolution had again, I mentioned everything from fascism, communism to the Luddite movement. There was basically an insurgency that played out inside industrial England. And a lot of people don't know the level of violence, factory owners being assassinated, things like that, mass street protests. The level of violence was such that more of the British Army was deployed to fight the Luddites than was deployed to fight the United States in what we call the War of 1812. They cared more about the Luddites than they did the entire US. And our Australia link, it was only ended after the mass deployment of their military. They execute all the ringleaders, and then they take a larger number and ship them off. Sort of the rank and file are shipped off to this colony across the world, because these are the troublemakers. So this, it wasn't just debtors. It was people who were part of these early protests against the Industrial Revolution that are part of the founding of Australia.
That's my family you're talking about there, Peter. So, and August, what do you think we need to do to avoid these robots taking over our lives?
I think we're going to have to keep this book out of the hands of any Australian, it sounds like. But I worry a lot about our lack of resiliency, on two fronts as a society in the U.S., but I think it's true for most of the Western democracies, particularly in Europe. The ability to exploit gaps and fissures in society is a well-known tactic from 2016 for the Russians. The Chinese are doing it now around coronavirus. This frenzy and I think furor over automation that's coming will similarly potentially be exploited. So, the genesis of like extremist movements that are often the product of either mass unemployment or lack of economic and social opportunity, I think is another worry. There are manifestations of that today that we see already. And the potential alignment of groups that wouldn't ordinarily find themselves in finding common cause may be, again, further upset with what has become of the social contract in America. And I think that is a reckoning we are really poorly equipped to deal with right now. And that people toss around terms like whole of society or whole of government. But, when you're really when you're addressing these kind of fundamental, very foundational, values-oriented questions, in terms of policy, you do have to have leaders that can help the country have a conversation like that. And we're just not there right now. Maybe we'll get there in the next 4 to 5 years. And if we do, I think that puts us on better footing for coming out of this stronger and not weaker. From an organized military's perspective too, some of the futures work that I've been doing lately and thinking about a lot is the end of the standing army. That if we do get to a point where the role of automated systems is such that the value on the battlefield or in the pre-battlefield, is great enough that the economic cost and even the social cost of having standing armies, particularly in Western Europe, may be such that there's a trade that's made, sometime in the late 2030s. I do think that the economic toll of the coronavirus pandemic and perhaps this economic dislocation that we just explore and burn in is also going to stress, the social systems in terms of providing for people, whether it's basic income, universal health care. In America, obviously, we're not set up to do that. Other countries already have those commitments in place, and paying for them is going to come at the expense of organized forces and things that we've built entire security architectures like NATO on. So imagine trying to have a conversation about 2% of GDP defense spending in a nation that has 55 or 60%. I wouldn't call it unemployment, but like non-employment, right? Because that's the level of technological adoption and sophisticatedness that a society has achieved. So while some might see it as a mark of progress, there is this other knock-on effect, which is substantial for these really basic security questions. Again, we're not having those kind of conversations as much, but thankfully I'm starting to see them and participating in them to get people to think about these factors.
And I'm, it's funny because we work together, but we also go back and forth. I'm not there yet in terms of, I think, the end of standing armies. That's maybe further out than I would go, but I definitely think, just like, steam engine, just like the computer, it will reshape. And look, we can already see this debate playing out right now. It reshapes everything from the recruiting side to the training side to organization and doctrine. The recruiting side, the head of AI for U.S. Special Operations Command talked about how, well, now in a world already right now, let alone 10 years moving forward, we have so much data that we know about potential recruits that we can figure out not just, are they apt for the military or not, but we can even figure out very specific units that they ought to go into. But then also as they're going through that, we can find the perfect match for them, background, psychologically, entire life history, by mining all the data around them. But we also will, he talked about how you will have tracking of every single shot that they've taken, for example, at the rifle range, their entire career. Every single time, similar that we're starting to see in sports athletes, every single tracking of every time they exercised, everything that they've done. And maybe instead they're an engineer, maybe instead they're a military lawyer. The point is, we'll have this kind of tracking, shaping, also advising them. Hey, you always seem to shoot slightly off to the right. The little avatar will pop up and say, remember not to do that. But then we get to the kind of training that people will need. I think about how, 15 years back, cybersecurity was a new thing. And then since then, we not only created all sorts of new military and government and business units for it, a cyber command, we also had to change the training for everybody else. And then the same thing is about to play out with AI and robotics. So it's not just an issue of, maybe you're replaced. It's also, no, everybody's going to be working with them and needs to understand even just the basics of it. And that's where we, hope to kind of kick in, is that we'll give people a sense of not only what are the different plans for how this all might be used, but here's some of the basics that you need to know. And
what I like is that at least even if standing armies do go, surely those of us who are in the reserves will still have a job, because not quite standing. But and you talk about the 100th anniversary of You Are the Play, and a lot of listeners might not know that the word robot comes from the Czech word robota. I'm not pronouncing that one correctly, but which means forced labor or serfs. So it's almost like we've transposed the fear of slaves and their revolts from, going as far back, I suppose, as the Roman servile wars, and legends like Spartacus. If he was a legend, he would have gone north past Transalpine Gaul and to freedom, really. But transpose that onto our image of the next version of that. So it's just. It's a fascinating sort of world to be in. I don't envy you, gents, trying to then put that into some sort of narrative, which you've done a fantastic job of, to try and then highlight these issues to people. Everything, and I like that you brought up, universal healthcare and a guaranteed basic income. In Australia, we have a very good welfare system in a lot of those aspects. But even coronavirus has highlighted the gaps, right? So how does underemployment due to AI and robotics affect it? Geez, you guys I'm glad it's morning, because you keep me up at night if I was thinking about these things late at night. We do have a question from Josh, who's one of our TDP community members, and we rarely let listener questions come in, but he just happened to finish Ghost Fleet yesterday when I was talking to him. That's Friday in Australia when he finished it. So I guess he finished it going back in time, your time now. So his question, and this is a kind of a blend of what he understands burn-in to be, and his reading of Ghost Fleet. He talks about how barbed wire was so instrumental on the Western Front. A very simple technology that had mind-blowing effects, I suppose. With this kind of in mind, he asks, what would be the equivalent of barbed wire in the technological space moving forward from 2020?
I'll jump on that first, and then August, you get the benefit of thinking longer and giving a better answer. We think it's the topic at the central part of burn-in. It's artificial intelligence that, of course, has all sorts of different manifestations and meanings, but essentially the ability for a machine to mimic or surpass human intelligence in some way, shape, or form. And it might be, I'm not saying it's smarter, it might be just, it's able to ingest more data, or it's able to operate at a higher speed, or whatever it is. There's lots of different aspects of this, but basically it's AI, and it's going back to it. It's the, application across a wide array of areas. It's how it makes hardware now intelligent. So a unmanned system that's starting to operate out there on its own, teaming with humans or whatnot, as we talked about. But it's also, I think it's going to be more akin to computers or electricity, where it surrounds you, shapes you, not just the decisions that are made, but literally the environment in which you're making them. And you don't even notice the way that it's shaping your decisions. I use an example, and we play with this in the book, of there was a U.S. Marine Corps landing exercise where they looked at all the different uses of robotics, and there was a lot of really cool stuff, and we carried that across into the book, some cool prototypes. But one of the most important was sort of the least sexy. It was a military version of what's called a Waze map. A Waze map is, basically GPS, but then it runs a bunch of simulations to provide recommended routes to go. And Waze does that by the simulations estimating your drive time. This one was running simulations that were estimating expected casualties. So it's basically the human was still in charge, but it was saying, if you go this way, your unit will take greater casualties than if you go that way. But of course, it's a simulation. It's not a guarantee. But, like we do with GPS, we listen to it. And I found that, just an utterly fascinating example, because you can see how it changes everything from the decisions that officer will make when they're getting those recommended courses of action. It will affect, I'm the son of a Army lawyer, a U.S. Army lawyer. So this is a court-martial waiting to happen, because, if someone either listens to the machine and they know they take greater casualties, they're going to blame the machine. But hold it, what if they don't listen to the machine and they take greater casualties? Then we'll say, you didn't listen to the machine, court-martial you. But, oh, by the way, let's tip our hat to the dead Prussian. The other side gets to vote. So it also is something that the other side is going to manipulate and play with. And it might be manipulating and play with, going after the system itself through cyber means, or it might be, here's what I think it's going to project, and they're going to do because it's advising them. So therefore I'm going to do this. And we have a lot of dastardly fun with that real world example in the book. But I think it's of that level. You can see how it changes everything. Just that one thing, it changes everything from, how you're thinking about going out on patrol in a future battle to how a criminal acts. We're starting to see how it changes the way politicians act.
Yeah.
I might riff on that even and say, with barbed wire in its, usage of channelizing forces, demarcating, a front line, impeding, infantry and kind of tactical movement. Is there, and it's inexpensive, right? It's a fairly, cheap technology. I wonder if you could use that AI, thread that Pete was pulling and say, could human-like or, automated chatbots, be kind of like the barbed wire, like in that very specific sense of the next 5 to 10 years of conflict, meaning you're able to, have that kind of tactical effect with social media, as Pete has, written ably about. So there's a really great question, wrapped up in that inquiry from your TDP community member. And it's thought-provoking for sure. And certainly something worth exploring with a little more ficant, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I'm encouraging all of our community members to write, and as I say, your writing doesn't actually need to go anywhere. In fact, listeners, I wrote a short fiction piece, must have been early last year, and I actually just sent it to August for some thoughts, and that's the only place it went. It was he was very gracious in his response to me, because I look back on it now, I was like, oh my god, I can't believe I let that out of the email outbox. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about creativity. It's important for people in this space, people in militaries, people who are policymakers. We're not just talking about uniform people. We're talking about people who write the policies that uniforms enforce. We're talking about law enforcement. We're talking about people like yourselves, key thinkers. I was going to say influencers, but I hate how that term's been changed now, right? So let's just say thinkers and advocates, I suppose, for exploring these issues. Why is using creative methods, useful fiction, why is this important, and why is it effective?
Ficant is, I think, a really great way to approach problems that conventional methodologies aren't working for. So you might be trying to think through the operating environment, maybe the impact, as we were just talking about, of automated bots on tactical operations in the Pacific in the mid to late 2020s. That's fundamentally a question of influencing human behavior. And so could you use, could you use a technology that really let you understand that human experience, that technology being fiction, perhaps even a thread of that, like crowdsourcing fiction, to use the imagination? Of course you could. And I think it's a sort of approach that doesn't need to supplant others, either more technical or traditional analytics, but I think it's one tool among many. And I think not being in a position of telling people they can't do other sorts of analysis, but rather this is something that's additive, helps create, I think, a more like open kind of mind when you're trying to tell someone they should be reading graphic novels or playing video games for work. It's not something I just tell my family. It's actually something I tell people day to day. The other approach too is if you look broadly at the democratization of technology around the world, especially those kinds of innovations that have military or strategic relevance, we have so little control over the usage and adoption of whether it's 3D printing, nano engineering. Won't have the best idea. One of the great things about Ficant or other kinds of narratives is that you can reach far more people than if you do what friend of the dead Prussian, Matt Brooks, would say is, to create printed Ambien or white papers. I do papers, of course, have a role. I write them sometimes, but I feel like there is also this huge opportunity that is potentially, overlooked in trying to reach far beyond the usual audiences. And guess what? Like fiction, film, video games are one of the best ways to reach as many people as possible across cultures. And I don't just mean internationally in that sense, but within organizations, because especially in the military, culture is a very powerful force in stymieing innovation sometimes or good ideas. And so to me, finding ways to bridge that, that are accessible, that are engaging and of course, by their very existence are an endorsement of a creative approach. I think that is giving you a better shot at overcoming some of these really, really wicked trends that are out there.
I would add two things. One is that look, in any aspect of the military, and it's the same for business, you have to ask what if. That's what your training is based off of. I'm training now on what if we went to war. Your budgeting, your acquisition is based off of that. The idea of Ficant, and again, much like August said, it is just one tool, just like in, SIGINT, HUMINT, you want all of them. But it allows you to ask those questions of what if. What if it was 10 years ahead, or what if it was this kind of scenario, a urban battle, or what if? And then it allows you not just to ask the what if, but drop people into that what if in an engaging manner that all the research actually shows is more likely to lead them to understand it and to take action afterwards. But there's a big, big caveat in all of this. And it's not just about being creative. It has to be grounded. We call it the no vaporware rule. It's, it can't be something that's imaginary. It has to be something that is pulled from the real world. The real world technology has to already exist in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's just a prototype at this stage, but it's got to be grounded. Similarly, again, to the dead Prussian side, grounded in terms of there's real world forces of friction and fog. So they better be in there. And that is where you see a lot of the, I would argue sometimes the war gaming and training go aside, but also when they engage the creative community go aside, is they don't have that other aspect of grounded, that research side of it. So to give a real world example, our CIA right after 9/11 invited a group of Hollywood writers to come in and, tell them on, what terrorists might do. And of course, they came up with like all sorts of wild, ungrounded stuff because, well, they weren't actually going, okay, here's what we know about Al-Qaeda. Here's what we know about critical infrastructure systems. Here's what we know. It was just, they were coming up with whatever was the coolest, but not the grounded. And so what we try and do is have that combination. You want it to be exciting, you want it to be interesting, but also it's got to be grounded. It certainly makes, when you're asking about the process, makes it a hell of a lot harder to write. Because, you wish you could have some situation where, the hero faces some kind of problem and, they pull out the MacGuffin device and it solves it, or they, like we see in the movies, we need to hack the system. Clickety clack. Oh, we're in, that sort of thing. No, that's not how it works. But as August was saying, that grounding, we think, makes it more compelling, makes it a lot scarier. Because when that person goes, holy crap, that was really, really freaky. Oh no, here's where it already happened in the real world. Or here's, the system that isn't from science fiction. But that's my, description of why I think the value of fiction, but also what you have to do to make it that truly useful fiction.
It's almost as a creative red team in a way, for those listeners understand oppositional thinking. So what we might do now, we might switch to our bonus questions for those people that value the show so much they throw us a bit of tin each month. So we'll have a quick pause. Now, gents, my final question is one I ask of all guests. Now, it relates to our mission on the show, which is to define war as in many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. And the reason we do this is so that we can continue the most important question around it is, what war is as a phenomenon in human society, the cost of war, and at the end of the day, help inform decisions about conflict, because it is the one of the most creative and one of the most destructive endeavors that the human race embarks upon. So I asked people to finish the sentence, war is. Now, August, you've had a crack at this twice before, so Peter certainly gets the first chance to answer this question. So Peter, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
War is inherently human no matter the technology. And if you need to flesh that out, the idea that whether it's someone picking up a stone or a drone out there, the causes are human. The flow of it, the interaction, the fog, the friction at some point has to involve humans, caused by humans. And most importantly, the costs of it are human. So it's inherently human no matter the technology.
So that's a brilliant response. I love it. And it's very Clausewitzian. War is an act of human interaction. I love it. And August, I guess the third bite at the cherry, you've got to get it right sometime.
I'm not sure this will be that time, but I'll try. I'm actually going to flip the question slightly and say war will be. So I would say that war will be an often violent machine speed contest of internal and external human narratives, which is a mouthful, but I think captures the transition that we're undergoing right now, and autonomous software and hardware.
It's interesting. Your first answer on the show was war is the continuation of narratives by other or violent means, which it's good to see you've got a thread. I will say a barrow to push. It's great. It's great to have you gents back on the show. So thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you very much for writing Burn In. And I guess August. Thanks for letting me steal an advanced review copy of it on my Kindle to have a read before everyone else, so that we can get things like this show happening and talk about it, because I think there's a lot of people out there that should read this book, and by a lot of people, everyone who picks up a book should have a read of this book, because it's not just for people who love a good thriller or techno thriller. It's for anyone who's going to have to interact with technology, and to be honest, that's all of us. So, gents, thanks very much for coming on the show.
All right, thank you,
Mick. Thanks a lot. Look forward to the fourth time.
I'll see you in 2 years. Now, ladies and gents, you can find Burn In on Amazon if you are an Amazon fan. Now, if you want to take some quick routes there, just go to our show notes. I'll have Burn In the links. I'll also put Ghost Fleet in the links as well. Go there, buy the book, keep food on the table in the Cole and Singer houses, but also, most importantly, do yourself a favor, buy them, then read them, and engage with the material, because it is such a fun way to engage with some of the biggest concepts that are out there and facing us in the area of international relations and national security. You can follow these two gents on Twitter. In fact, that's what I do, and that's how I've connected with them in the past. So you can follow Peter at Peter W. Singer, and you can follow August at August_Cole. Jump on there, follow, engage with them. They're quite friendly on there. They're quite friendly in real life too, which is quite good. So that's always a benefit when someone lives up to their Twitter persona. For those listeners that have been listening in and hearing the term TDP community, that's actually a social network that's private to subscribers of the Dead Prussian podcast. So for a range of subscription options, you can join the community. We do things like reading groups, writing groups, importantly writing groups. We even have a Roman history study group on the network. We jump on there, we talk to each other. We do COVID check-ins at the moment once a month, just to make sure everyone's going all right and coping with the being locked in their houses. So please jump on the subscription network and have a chat with us there. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.